welcome today's new episode of the Love Procurement Podcast. My name is Kelly Barner, and I'll be your host for this conversation. Today, I'm glad to welcome two guests, Thomas Udesen, Chief Procurement Officer at Bayer and co-founder of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, as well as Oliver Hurrey, lead of the Champions Program. So Thomas and Oliver, thank you both so much for being with me.
Welcome. Thank you for letting us share our love. There's a lot going around.
There is a lot to go around. And actually, before we start sharing love, let's learn a little bit more about each of you. Thomas, we introduced you in with a couple of different titles here, but what do you think is it relevant for listeners and viewers to know about your professional experience to this point?
Ooh, that's a big question. I guess my experience can be divided into 3 decades. The first decade, I was a business-to-business timber trader, so really being out and about, getting a flavor of the wonderful diversity of our world, living in Africa and Asia, and different experiences. The second decade, I had the pleasure of working with the procurement team in Johnson & Johnson. So in those days, it was really where strategic procurement, strategic sourcing, e-auctions, low-cost country sourcing, those concepts came about. In the last decade, I've been with Bayer, where it's a lot around procurement transformation, digitalization, big topic of sustainability. So I would put it into sort of three decades, and that's how I have built this love of procurement that we are here to talk about.
And is there anything specific that you love about procurement that you want to call out at the start of this conversation?
I just think that there is, no end in what's possible within procurement. We can really, if you can think it, you can do it. I think we're one of these unique functions that work all along the value chain. So whether it is in sort of product creation, whether it's now over production, whether it's in sales and marketing, we are really everywhere, and I think that's important. I also like the fact that we have an impact, right? So we do absolutely the deals that we make, they make the world go around. We have a big role when it comes to sustainability. The decisions we make impact lives for good or bad, and I think that responsibility that we carry is something that we should be super privileged about, but also very conscious about.
Absolutely. Procurement with pride, right? Now, Oliver, how about you? Tell me about your professional journey to this point.
Yeah, even though I look a decade older than Thomas, I am a decade less than Thomas. So I've had a couple of decades of doing work around this. So probably the first 10 years of my career was spent mostly working with sustainability professionals. And I think if you'd gone back 20 years to look at the average sustainability professional, they were very lonely, sat in the corner of the office, wanting everyone to pay attention to them or listen to them, very passionate, good storytellers, but often weren't necessarily, not necessarily trusted, but certainly not really understood by the rest of the business. Some, but not all, and some businesses pioneered, but most sustainability professionals were very lonely. I probably then spent the next 10 years working with procurement professionals who, again, often were in the office and wondering if anyone was really paying attention to the work that they were doing, and the skills that they had, and the value that they were creating. So it's been working with two professions that I feel ultimately are going to play such a critical role in the future of business, and in fact have played a critical role in the past of business as well. But I think incredibly so, both are going to work together more so than ever before to drive change. And I think that's been probably my journey, is getting those professions together to realize what value they can create, both individually and collectively. And I think as I go into worryingly my third decade, I realize that it's probably going to be the intersection between those two functions, and possibly more functions, as business realizes that this is a more collaborative issue internally than it ever was before. So that's probably been my time, and brings me right up to date. Obviously, in the last 4 or 5 years with Thomas, we created the Sustainable Procurement Pledge to really empower and equip procurement to realize the future that it has, both for its own profession, but also for the people and planet. So,
And has that given you a new opportunity to maybe think about something that you love about procurement?
What do I love about procurement? I think after a long time talking to sustainability professionals who talk a good game, but have traditionally not been good at doing a good game, I think the thing that I love about procurement is they get stuff done. They're doers, and they're not wanting to sit around and talk about things forever. They want to get things done. And I think I've always had a love of procurement. I remember the very first activities I did in business was running a Meet the Buyers event, where we had procurement professionals sat down and just whistling through opportunities one after the other to try and find value. And they loved it. And I think that energy and that passion has stayed with me. I think in the last few years, particularly with COVID, though, I think procurement's proven that if it wants to get something done, it can get it done.
Yes.
And I think if you look at the sustainability and climate challenge we have, to see a profession excited about that can make stuff happen almost overnight if it needs to, is particularly exciting. So yeah, I love the ability for procurement to get things done.
And I actually think that provides us with a great transition into the topic that we're going to focus on for most of today's conversation, which is sustainability and even more specifically emissions. So Thomas, if we follow off the spirit of what Oliver was saying about procurement getting things done, why is it so important for procurement to play an active role in their company's emissions program?
And I guess Oliver would be able to confirm this. Trying to have an ambition around decarbonization without aligning on how you're going to do it, or also the ambition level that you are going for with procurement, I mean, it's an illusion, right? Whether you are looking at your own operations, scope 1 and 2, where it's all about how do you transition towards renewable energy, how do you have efficiency measures, circularity. I mean, these are big topics within scope 1 and 2. Procurement is the one that needs to be a catalyst, make all those deals possible, the PPAs that needs to come out of that. So even if you are a service industry where you don't have necessarily a lot of scope 3, the only way that you can actually operationalize ambitions is through and with procurement. Now, if you're a manufacturing company, and we are, and many organizations are, you sit with 80-90% of your carbon in scope 3. And there you go. That's 100% what you source from your suppliers here. So making sure that your messages, your targets are aligned with the decision making, that you make sure that these ambitions is hardwired into how do you perform your tenders, your RFXs, how do you make sure that you can value what you are planning to do and make everyday decisions. That's obviously requiring procurement participation. And we also find, thankfully, that there are so many procurement practitioners out there who are super passionate about this. They absolutely get it. They find purpose in doing the right thing. So it sort of adds to the amazingness of procurement. So bring it on.
Well, and it's interesting because one of the things that I think ends up being challenging, this actually combines some of what you've both said so far, is that not only is procurement excellent at getting stuff done, but a lot of times we become the point of transition. So something that's vision or mission or ambition or aspiration elsewhere in the business, there's a lot of enthusiasm and passion around sustainability and reduced emissions. But somewhere along the way, that has to turn into a checklist or a priority of things to be taken action on. Oliver, how do you find procurement most successfully takes all of that positive energy and manages to channel it into concrete things that people can go out and do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's been a lot of discussion over the last few years about how to get procurement to do things differently or change or evolve or all of those things if you're working in sustainability. And of course, the world's changing, business is changing, supply chains are changing. So change is important. But actually, channeling what procurement are already brilliant at is key. A lot of things we need in sustainability and to drive emissions reduction in supply chains is consistency, is alignment with the business, is alignment with cost, it's alignment with value. It's about leadership. It's about creativity. It's about innovation with suppliers. It's about a lot of it is about supplier engagement. A lot of it is about supplier relationships. And procurement's already pretty good at those things. And so sometimes I wonder, this idea of trying to get procurement to think differently or change or evolve. I think obviously some of that's true, but a lot of it is about harnessing what they're already brilliant at. And I think that is critical. So procurement professionals, that particularly the ones in the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, come to me and Thomas and the rest of the team and are sort of saying, what can I do? How can I do more? How can I get my business to do more? And a lot of it is to do, well, embed it into what you already do. And so use your skills, use what you already know about the business, use what you've got, and leverage it for, more value, more emissions reductions. So I think a lot of it is about doing what they already do. I'll double down again on that supplier engagement piece, whether it's trying to embed contracts, clauses, whether it's about collecting data, whether it's about actually driving reductions, which is what it should all be about, really, in terms of emissions reduction. It all starts with supplier engagement. You can't do any of it without having a good conversation with your suppliers. So I feel like a lot of people ask me, what's the one thing that procurement could do that's easy, or what could they do first, and all of these things. And it's often the answer is just start talking to your suppliers. You don't have to be an expert on these things. You can just start asking them about, have they set a science-based target? Have they invested in renewable energy? Have they, there's some really, what we often talk about is no excuse, no regret actions that procurement could be doing. And they're really simple things that you don't need to be an expert on. So I think that's probably one thing. I think the other thing is that procurement's eternally been asked to be experts at everything, every topic, every disaster, every crisis. Yeah. Procurement's designed to be an expert. And I think that's the challenge with sustainability and emissions. It's yet another batch of very technical things for them to be experts on. But I think a lot of procurement realizing that actually it just comes down to very similar things to do with cost and value and price. It's about understanding where those risks lie, understanding where the opportunities lie, and asking the right questions at the right time to drive a bit of action. So there's a lot of things that are the same.
And I imagine a lot of those questions and conversations that procurement might have with suppliers would also be relevant to have with procurement's leadership team. Understanding where the general mindset, where the priorities are, what's driving a sustainability program within the company before going out to have those external conversations. Thomas, I recognize that this is a super generalized question, but I'd be interested to hear from you what the general current attitude towards sustainability is in most companies and industries. And again, I know extremely broad, we're talking global, multiple forms of businesses and industries, but what do you find sort of the current temperature is around sustainability?
So certainly in all the large corporations, there is a very, very high awareness, but I would say increasingly so also in the small, medium-sized organizations. Urgency is increasing, and in some areas where people haven't really been in this game for very long, you start seeing signs of panic, where people are getting very, very conscious that there are regulations that will very soon be real, and they simply haven't done their homework, and they are not ready. So the awareness, urgency is absolutely there. I think certainly on the retail side, but also some industry players who are typically quite significant when it comes to carbon emissions are leading the way. So one of the examples is like Together for Sustainability, where I have the pleasure of being on the steering teams in the chemical industry. But you also see that now in cement industry, steel industry. So there are some very, very tangible activities going on. And I guess it's also a result of the, common knowledge that there is generally too little going on. We are halfway, towards the ambition around 2030 for many organizations. Regulations are coming up, so the urgency is there.
And when you open the conversation talking about your own background, you sort of broke it down into 3 roughly decades-long chunks. I imagine a wide-ranging initiative like sustainability, where there's a maturity process, and we've mentioned regulations are also picking up speed and starting to take effect. Are we seeing something similar happen around the practice of sustainability? Is there sort of an immature phase where it's focused on awareness, and then in the next phase where industry leaders are voluntarily stepping up and driving change and then moving to a more mature, really industry-wide forced change beyond that. Where would you say we currently are in terms of that maturity journey?
I think you're right. I mean, the topics come in waves, right? So if I go back to even in my timber days in the first decade, it was around deforestation, right? So the FSC certification was done, and then we got into palm oil, sort of the second decade, and now, of course, we have a period where it's very much around human rights. It's about inclusiveness, but also the decarbonization. And I think this voluntary awareness phase is, of course, coming to an end quite quickly. 2030 is around the corner. So if you look at from a regulatory perspective, like the CBAM, where you have topics like potentially tax, so carbon tax being introduced across different commodities, that's a real deal that will impact business. But also many of the multinationals are really serious when they ask their suppliers to decarbonize. And if you simply don't do it, and if your product carbon footprint doesn't show any signs of improving, they will take business away from you. So it's not just the regulations, it's really from a customer, a value chain perspective. We mean business, and if you are sleeping and if you have other priorities, we're probably going to take the business to somebody else.
And that's an interesting point, Oliver. As Thomas talks about the role of consumer, this is another reason to love being in procurement. We get to be double consumers because we're all consumers as individual people making choices about how to spend our money and the brands that we back. But we're also helping to make those decisions with corporate resources that are being spent. And then, of course, there's the government sector. We chatted a little bit about that before we started recording today. Do you see it making a difference who the customer is, whether it's individual consumers, whether it's other businesses, whether it's governments? How does that play a role in driving, even if it's just the level of urgency around sustainability?
Yeah, I think we're in a perfect storm where there is, no matter who you are and who you work for, there are a multitude of opportunities and pressures around you. So Thomas talked about the regulation there. Whether you're in North America or Europe, and people often talk about the fact that we're probably a little bit more mature on sustainability in Europe than we are in North America. I think that's in many ways slightly patronizing of the North Americans. I think North Americans are very aware of this. It's just different drivers, and often North America will zoom past us all eventually and solve it. So I think in America, you're seeing a lot of regulation. Obviously, what's coming out of California, Thomas mentioned the carbon border adjustment mechanism. That's a real driver. Now, whether you sell into government, and particularly in the US, you've got the US supply chain program that is really demanding that suppliers to the federal government have carbon plans and things like that. That is a key driver if you want to supply government, and obviously a lot of billions and billions of dollars is associated with that, then you've got to get that sorted. Now, that's whether you care about climate or not. You want your business to carry on being competitive, you've got to do it. I think the obvious answer is you're obviously seeing consumer demand increasing. That will continue. But ultimately, as I said, we need to create the products and services to give to consumers so they don't end up having a choice in the future. They'll just have, everything will be sustainable, everything will be better, because that's better long-term business decisions as well. And if business doesn't decide that, then regulation will catch up as well. So no matter who you provide, whether it's consumers, whether it's government, the pressures are there. If you're B2B, I think not what we're seeing now, and I think Thomas has seen this in the chemicals industry, you're seeing a competitive advantage now being woven in through product carbon footprints. You are going to make decisions on different chemicals or different ingredients based on increasingly robust data on product carbon footprints. And that means that your product will have a source of a competitive advantage if it can provide that data, if it can provide evidence of better formulations or better decisions in the supply chain. So it's a competitive advantage. It's a regulatory kind of demand. It's a consumer demand. It's also just a personal demand. I mean, I doubt there are many people of mine and Thomas's ages and maybe even a little bit younger and certainly a little bit older whose children and grandchildren aren't looking at them now and saying, what do you do, Dad and Mum? What do you do at work? And that pressure is building. And I think peer pressure is building. So it does feel like a perfect storm, and I think procurement's at the centre of it. And it's, again, not about procurement being at the centre of it, having it happen to procurement. We want to see procurement out front and saying, well, we're going to lead this, we're going to drive this. And I think that's where procurement should and could be.
Yeah. And Thomas, I'd like to have you weigh in on geography as well. To me, it's such an interesting point because how you think about geography will very quickly demonstrate that there are a lot of different fronts to be thinking about sustainability on. There's where is your company headquartered? There's where are your business units? Where are you selling? Where are you transporting things from? You talked about scope 3, which brings in suppliers and the supply chain. That makes it feel very complicated very quickly. And if we have a procurement team that's trying to sort of get their arms around this emissions challenge, do you start with what's close to home and feel more confident and expand? Do you try to figure out where you can have the greatest impact the fastest geographically? How do you recommend that teams sort of reconcile the multi-location, multi-organization, even multi-regulation situation that comes along with geography?
Yeah, I think the current patchwork of sort of regulations is a function of, I guess, history and priorities in any particular country. And it's probably also a function of sort of political sentiments. And what, of course, we need is simpler regulations that are harmonized, that recognizes the different topics and the efforts that companies are doing, particularly multinationals, right? So, as you say, it can very quickly become a bureaucratic obstacle for progress if that doesn't happen. I think a lot of those conversations are thankfully taking place, at different levels, whether it's under the UN or whether it's OECD or World Trade. There is an awareness that regulations have become too difficult to navigate, and with this, we are not really creating a level playing field where we focus on impact and progress. We spend much too much time on reporting and in a way validating figures. So, and that's not very smart. I do think independently of that, though, that again there are different industries that are pushing forward, and we did talk about the chemicals, but and there, of course, the requirements are independent of location. That in a way you're pitching yourself at a level that oversees all those different requirements that are here today, but also that are anticipated. And I just want to comment also on Oliver, your point around, yes, of course, US have a different history. We have spent a lot of time also with government-supported programs around inclusiveness and diversity. Decarbonization has not been the core focus in the last maybe decades, but that is changing very much so right now. And I just want to provide a sunshine story that actually the biggest private deal that we have ever done around renewable energy is in US, without government support, but where it is just good business, where you can really save a lot of money by also moving into renewables. So there are many companies, there are many individuals, there are many states who are very, very interested in decarbonization as well. So,
yeah. And Thomas, not to be the clouds on your sunshine story by any means, but procurement often finds themselves in the somewhat unenviable position of trying to motivate people for whom sustainability is not a high priority. And I know we've talked about it being good business, right? So there are a lot of different types of business impacts that can come from a better understanding of an investment in emissions and sustainability. But Oliver, if we're trying to really win somebody over that's a skeptic, somebody that says, no, but we have all these other problems, all these other things that we need to focus on, what are some other ways in? What are some of the other related business objectives that a skeptic or somebody that's not ranking sustainability as very high on their priority list might be able to be brought into the effort because they see the related impact that we can have on something that they do care very much about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if you think back to the last couple of decades and more of the sustainability movement, if you want to call it that, the idea has always been that if we shout and scream loud enough, eventually everyone will notice. And I think everyone's realized that there will always be a group of people who will maybe even deny it, or quite often the case is just a bit too frightened. And when they're frightened, they just refuse to believe it happens, because if you believe that something isn't going to happen, then maybe that makes you feel more comfortable about it. And there's a lot of people like that, and they never admit it. But at the end of the day, we need everyone on this journey. So what is the common denominator in business? Well, money. Everyone's got some element of driven by money. So ultimately, I think the movement that me and Thomas are a part of at the moment, and we're getting very excited about, is a group of procurement leaders seeing that they can make decisions in their supply chain based on carbon as a metric that is being included alongside cost. So I think that's happening now. If that happens, and things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism ultimately are putting a price on carbon, it doesn't matter whether you care about climate change or not, or whether you're, whatever it is, the future of your business, the costs associated with running your business are going to be inextricably linked to this thing that you're one of the only few people that don't believe in. So you're going to have to make some decisions based on that, obviously. I think also, and it's something that we talk about a lot, whether you believe in protecting the people or planet or anything like that. If you don't, there's obviously something wrong with you, really. But I mean, even if you don't, you probably care about your profession. Yeah. And if you care about your profession and your career, this is the future of your profession and career. You can't get away from it. I've used an analogy recently, but we're all frogs in a boiling pot of water. Now, if you're a frog that realizes that pot is heating up and that we're all in trouble, and knows that it needs to jump out and turn the dial down, then that's great. But maybe you're just a frog in that pan who is too blinkered to look at that heat rising, and is just getting annoyed by all the bubbles bubbling around and can't do their job properly. So regardless of whether you need to turn the heat down or you just want all the bubbles to get out of the way so you can carry on doing your job, there's a lot of crisis, there's a lot of disruption coming. And whether you believe in these things or not, it's clear. So whether it's a personal belief, whether it's a professional belief, all of those things add up to the same thing. You've got to take action to ultimately mean that we can have, ultimately more profit, more sustainability, a better future, or just an easier job. All of those things are centered around these crises, and no one wants one crisis after the other. And I think after COVID, we all don't want another one of those too soon. So I think that's another reason where you can look at these things through a fresh lens and go, do you know what? Even if they're half right, this is going to be a real disruption for my supply chain and for my business. So I think that times are changing there, and I think that's a positive thing. But we're not just demanding people believe it anymore. We're just saying, look, here's a number of different reasons that should force you to act.
Well, it is interesting. I was actually recently reading something entirely outside of procurement that ends up being relevant in this conversation, that the opposite of love is not hate, it's fear. And maybe one of our first steps as procurement is understanding that, okay, if you're not actively loving this effort around emissions right now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you hate trees or people or frogs, right? What it might mean is that you're just simply nervous about what's the right step to take and how do you get started. Thomas, let me sort of pull you in as we start to wrap up this part of the conversation. Do you see fear and uncertainty as playing a role holding companies back? Can procurement, through information, through passion, how do we help the whole organization overcome that fear and uncertainty that they might have, especially if they see it as being associated with some form of risk? Can we be the positivity that is needed to drive the positive cycle of change that most companies honestly do want to start?
Yeah, I mean, this is what we are good at. I would say, looking at the sort of disruptors of the world out there, trying to translate that into tangible action that doesn't make it seem so scary for people to develop that fear. So that's what procurement is doing. I think the fact is, and even if you look back, I mean, I've been around for 3 decades in the business to business. There was always a crisis. There was always something coming up, and it sort of divided the herd. There were people who were embracing it, thinking this is great, this is an opportunity, and there were the other half who saw it as a threat and something you'd rather have go away. Procurement is this change catalyst that, in a way, looks at it. It's a fact. We got to deal with it. How do we do that best possible? And bring people along, and in a way make it less scary. The good thing is, and that's one of the dimensions also that makes procurement practitioners unique. We have come to understand that progress and solutioning has to happen in groups. You gotta collaborate with people. We very few of us think that we will figure much out in isolation. So we are natural collaborators, and when we reach out and ask, how did you do it in your industry or with your competitors, respecting obviously all those antitrust dimensions that are there for a good reason. When you ask those questions, you'll be astounded by the support that's out there. So you'll get a lot of love, you will get a lot of support to solve problems, because there isn't much that somebody hasn't already thought about.
Now, if we leave people with something actionable, we're thinking of this in terms of the show as sharing the love. Thomas, what would be a piece of advice that you would like to share with anybody that's heard or watched this conversation?
Well, I think this notion that you are not alone. This is not your problem. This is our problem. And SPP, the Sustainable Procurement Pledge community, we are now around 15,000. We are in pretty much all the countries. It's a community of practitioners like you and me, who just want to help capacity build and democratize the knowledge instead of wasting time searching for stuff that somebody has already done. So my strong recommendation and lovable invitation is to join the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. Tap into this community who is just here to help. We have the World Sustainable Procurement Day coming up here on Equinox. It's March 21st, always March 21st, so you can plan that for the next many years. This is sort of a marathon of sessions, 24 hours, a full day, where we share knowledge, where you get to the cutting edge of this is how we have done stuff. So again, don't try to fight this on your own. Find some friends, create some chapters, and open your mindset.
And Oliver, how about you? What piece of advice, what takeaway would you share with listeners?
I think Thomas has nailed, obviously, the collaboration piece. I think talk more. So talk to your other, don't be afraid to say to others in your procurement team, I'm intrigued about how we might look through sustainability more as a lens for more value for the business. Famously, people talk about procurement not being great collaborators internally. So go and talk to your other departments, talk to operations, talk to finance, particularly talk to R&D and product. What could you do for them rather than what they want you to do for them? So I think having that different conversation and saying, hey, what about if I came to you with more options that are more sustainable or lower cost or lower carbon or things like that. So talk more there. Talk more with your suppliers. I think we've already talked about that. The single most important thing you can do is start just in all of those interactions with suppliers, just start asking them a few extra questions. It doesn't matter if, you don't necessarily know not what to do with the answers, but some simple things like, are you setting science-based targets? As a simple website, SBTI, you can go and find out what that means. Are you investing in renewable energy? These are questions that you can keep asking. Asking about certifications, asking about these things. So keep talking with your suppliers, keep talking internally, keep talking with each other. I think the final thing is start to talk outside of your silos. So one thing that's frustrated me over many decades is that human beings, particularly business human beings, silo ourselves into industry sectors or into functions or things like that. We've got to start, the old cliche of talking outside the box, thinking outside the box. You've got to. Particularly in procurement, I think often you share the categories with other people in other businesses. So start to think about that. You might share regions of the world with other people. Had a fascinating conversation with the likes of GSK and others over recent years about mint. So whether you put mint in chocolate or whether you put mint in other things, toothpaste, you'd never think that toothpaste and chocolate would have much in common, but they do. The people who buy mint in those organizations both share a challenge in northern India with water stress, diesel generators, all of these things. And so you start to realize that chocolate and toothpaste can work together, then anyone can. And so I think thinking outside of those silos is a really important thing. So thinking and talking with people up, down, left, and right, I think is crucial. And I think the final one possibly for procurement is talk upwards as well. This idea of procurement not having a seat at the table and all this sort of thing. I think procurement increasingly can talk to the executive leadership and say, we've saved your bacon over the last few years on COVID and everything else. We have the right to be able to have a conversation to tell you where we think the next crisis and next waves and next opportunities are coming. So I think the opportunity to use sustainability to talk upwards, downwards, left and right, I think is very important.
Well, this has been an incredibly interesting and timely conversation, of course, with World Sustainable Procurement Day coming up. Oliver and Thomas, thank you both so much for being with me and sharing your point of view and your passion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.